All right. Hey, y'all. I'm Pastor Drew at Spirit in the Hills Lutheran Church, or just Drew this evening. And we're trying a new thing. And I've got my friend Brandon here to help us out. So you're like, what is this? What is this? All questions considered. I follow one or two of these people or the church or something and had these questions, or these guys wouldn't shut up about it for the last week. Here's the way I have been talking about what we're trying to do. Give a little bit of space to engage curiosity, to strengthen our muscles. I was having some conversation lately about like we're not so good at discomfort as a people right
Mm,
now, and so to strengthen our muscles around like how do we sit in discomfort and uneasiness and when we don't know answers, because goodness knows that's the world right now in a lot of ways. And then finally, how do we sit with the questions themselves? How do we love the question for the sake of the question without jumping straight to answers? And so we're going to try and sit in that space a little bit on Tuesday nights at 9. And so I'm here with my friend Brandon. And before I hand it to him, I'll just say like we have known each other since loosely since elementary school. Like we
yeah.
grew up in the same general area, and in Oak Hill in the greater Austin area, and went to didn't really become close friends until middle school, high school a little bit, and then honestly better friends in the last 5 years than we
Yeah.
were, even though we've known each other for 25 years. And so I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself and how he's been talking about this to other people, and then we'll jump in. We
Yeah.
also know, yeah, we're trying stuff for the first time, so take it away, bud.
Yeah. I love you said that so well, Drew. Creating a space to practice the muscles of discomfort and question. For me, you said that so well, but for me, really what this is just doing what I like to do with you just in front of other people online. Is
There you go.
I like to bring you questions and say, Drew, what do you think about this? And I'm always looking for an answer. And I don't know if you've ever once really given me an actual answer. You do such a good job of just like holding the question and making space for it. And I walk away feeling something shifts in me every time I ask you a question. I walk away and I go, he never actually answered it, did he? So this is just doing what I love to do with you, just doing it live on whatever, or on Facebook and YouTube. And so that's what this is for me. But yeah, we've known each other for a long time, but it's been the past 5 or so years we've gotten close, because 5 or so years ago was when I had a flood of questions about my faith. I grew up Christian, pastor's kid, and was a former pastor myself. And then about 5 years ago, lost all sense of certainty in my belief. And I used to be so certain about things, and I found I could no longer be certain. So I came to you with a bunch of questions, and ever since then, I haven't stopped pounding you with my favorite faith questions. So that's why I'm excited about this and this space, and for other people to get to ask you questions, and for you to not actually answer them, but just make some transformational space for them. So
Well, it always
uh,
that makes me think of my mom. One of my mom's good friends always told me I was going to be a politician, and turns out at least I picked up the not directly answering a question part.
yeah, you've got that down. But the politician leaves you unsatisfied when you leave, and I always leave going, man, something feels different in me after Drew didn't answer my question.
Well, good. Yeah, before we hop into the meat of it, this is a new thing. We're just trying a thing, and so we'll be here for at least 30 minutes. We've kind of said we're going to give it a shot. We have some questions that folks like you asked us ahead of time. Brandon put together some other questions, and so we'll kind of sift through those. But at the same time, and look, I have this like fancy little thing. If you have any questions about tonight, we're going to talk about faith and certainty and uncertainty. We're kind of talking about what the show's about. What do you do with questions? How do you hold questions? How do they relate to what's going on? What's the role of certainty and uncertainty when it comes to faith? So ask whatever questions you got, especially about that. And if they're not about that, or if we don't get to them tonight, hopefully we'll pick them up and pick them up for the next week. So that's a little bit of hope and where we're at. And yeah, I'm probably not gonna answer a whole lot of questions, but we'll talk about a lot of questions,
Yeah.
and we'll see how it goes.
I love it, Drew. All right, should we just jump right in here to the first question, which I got this question from asking people on Facebook. What questions do they have about certainty and faith? And here's one of the ones I thought was just a good question to kick it off: is why are people so afraid of asking hard questions about their faith or asking hard questions about God? Yeah, I think that's a great one to kick it off. Like, for me, that's totally true. Is it used to, and still sometimes is, hard for me to even ask the real hard questions. So why do you think it's so hard? Why are people so afraid of asking hard questions about faith?
Yeah, I think there's a few things at play, and one of your rephrasings maybe helps out a little bit, right? Like the one and the question itself, right? Why are people afraid? I don't know. Fear's a weird thing, and it doesn't always make sense. But I think there's a few pieces of it, and we'll probably circle back around to some of those and some of the other questions. But like, I think there's a fear of the way knowledge relates, right? So the way that we think about things, a lot of stuff is related to other things, or a lot of times when we're asking questions, it's like, okay, we have like syllogistic logic, and I think of like my geometry proofs and things, right? Like if this, then this, then this, A relates to B as B relates to C. And so we're afraid of like maybe the unraveling of that.
Yeah.
Perhaps we've grown up in a culture, and not just the church, but I think we're in a culture generally where sometimes as well as great as our educators are about encouraging questions, I don't know if our culture always encourages like good, honest questions. I find myself, even if people aren't afraid of their question or to ask a question, they don't always know the way to articulate the question they really want to ask. So
Hmm.
sometimes it is this line of questioning that
Yeah.
then leads to like, well, is what you're really worried about this? And sometimes that's a big scary thing. Like, does God exist? Does the way I've always thought about things is that not actually the way that things work? We can find a lot of a sense of security in knowing something.
Hmm.
I just was at a continuing education type event at our Synod Assembly. Our guest speaker, the Reverend Kelly Chapman, talked about how European culture and sort of like white American culture also then is a culture of acquisition. Like it's about acquiring more knowledge. So you'd be like, well, aren't we great at shouldn't we be the best at questions, right? Shouldn't we always want to know more? But I think maybe we're afraid that if we're asking those questions, it's like, oh, we don't know. So I had a really bad fault as a kid of like, I just make stuff up, and I still Lee will poke me sometimes when we're like out with friends, because I'll say something that like I'm making a lot of assumptions, but I have a habit of saying it in a way where it seems like fact, and it's not. And it's not. And so there's like, I think there's some culture around it, and depending on, I don't know who was asking this, but some places shut down questions. Some situations and cultures and families shut down questions. And as a parent, I'm also know that like sometimes you have to stop answering the why question. Like it's just going to go on forever.
Yeah.
But the trick is to do it in a way that doesn't shut down questions. And the same thing as a pastor or at a company or whatever, right? Like you want to encourage questions in that line of thinking, even though sometimes you need to move on and look in a different direction. And sometimes we're bad at that. And so then we sort of learn, whether we think about it or not, I'm not supposed to ask questions.
Yeah.
They don't like questions. I'm annoying them with my questions.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get annoyed at questions, which is why we're trying to do this, right? Like
That's so true. Like maybe we learned, when we were 3 years old, asking why, like, if I ask too many questions, it upsets the big people in the room, the authorities or the parents. And then I love what you said about education system is so much good, but it also kind of plays into this. The goal is to know the answer. The goal isn't to really hold and ask the question. The goal is to get to the answer as quick as you can. yeah, maybe that seeps in at a deep level even to our faith. And I think I love what you said about the unraveling, that it's often our questions don't exist in silos, but are connected to these other things. And I totally felt that for myself is when I started asking some questions about these things. It wasn't just asking a question about God or asking a question about Jesus. It was asking a question about the fundamental things in my life. And so it felt scary to like play with this thing over here was kind of playing with my whole life. And so it totally makes sense. I
Yeah,
love,
right. What is the question related to?
yeah.
And yeah, and are you supposed to question that thing?
Mm,
But I mean, like, I don't know. My question in return is, what do you read in scripture about like questions, right? I feel like all the main characters are constantly asking questions to
mm,
God and one another. Um, and so if we are to sort of model our faith or find anything about our faith, it shouldn't be that we don't ask questions. Um, I don't know. We get it. We get it. Maybe it's quips. I don't know. Maybe we're too much of a bumper sticker culture, right? Like
mm.
Jesus is the answer, kind of a thing. But it's like,
Yeah.
well, no, I've got the answers. And it's like,
Yeah,
well,
the answer is
I don't
always
know.
yeah.
Sometimes Jesus' answer was a question.
Yeah, yeah.
Often, actually, often, or a story.
So, okay, I want to go to another question because I know we could spend
Sure.
an hour on any of one of these. But let me ask this about Christianity. Am I supposed to believe everything about Christianity? Because sometimes I only believe some parts of it and not other parts, or I'm certain or feel more certain about some parts, but I have a lot of doubts about others. So, am I supposed to take it all as one whole and believe it all? How do I handle that?
Yeah. Um, I don't know. Part of me wants to, with this question, again, just to play around in the question for a second, to pick apart this idea of like, am I supposed to?
Hmm.
Um, and just like, well, what's the assumption behind that? Like that there is a one right way. Who is supposing, right, or who is
Yeah.
imposing this? Um, and the other thing that I jump really quickly to is this, just like a response of a question of, um, do all Christians believe everything in the exact same way? Right? Or like, what's the diversity of the tradition throughout the world today, let alone
Yeah.
looking back at the last 2,000 years? And so that would be maybe my first response is just, what does it look like in other people? You know, uh, do you in looking at other folks get the feeling that you're supposed to believe it all, in all the right way? And maybe, but I wonder if we zoom out a little bit like that and recognize the breadth and diversity of the Christian tradition. If we look at that, I mean, I think about, I'm teaching some church history courses at the church right now, and we're talking about the creeds, and they weren't created until like centuries after the death of Christ. And that's the first time when it's like, well, there's something to believe, and it's like, well, what's the believe everything? Because for me, as a pastor, like I say that I believe and teach the creeds and confessions of the
Mm,
church, um, and the scripture, and it's like, okay, well, so you're talking about those things, but I don't necessarily say that I'm professing the creeds and confessions of another church or denomination within Christianity.
mm.
Um and then I think there's even room to play around in you know even if you were then to press me, well, Drew, get out your book of Concord and walk me through, right? Like, how do you look at this and hold this? And am I supposed to? And it's like, oh, who are you asking? Are you asking my denomination? Like, do they think I'm supposed to? Probably. But then I'd kind of turn it back to them. Okay, well, what does that look like? And even there, you might would find or would find a diversity of understandings. So yeah, I guess mostly my response there is, I'd like to examine that "supposed to" word.
I love
And
that.
then I just like to affirm the where you're at, right? Well, I'm with some stuff. It's like, great, glad you're here. I think about the in the Great Commission, like Jesus, the risen Jesus is among the people, right? And he's sending everybody, and it's like they all worshipped him and some doubted. And I'm like, okay, so like the people who didn't believe everything, yeah, they were still there. They were still there worshiping and in awe. They were still given a mission to go teach and share the love of God. And they didn't believe everything, like it says, and they doubted. So I don't know. There's room for sure. In my understanding of, like, I don't know, but who's supposed to, and who is supposing, and who's, placing that imposition on you.
I love it. And I hope the higher ups in your denomination are watching this.
Of course, yeah.
I think I'm supposed to, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah, I don't know. My bishop did like the post, so I don't know if Bishop Sue is here or not.
Welcome, Bishop. Welcome to Drew breaking the rules. I remember a handful of years ago learning. I knew there were other traditions. I come from kind of like the evangelical Christian tradition. And I knew that there were some other traditions. I knew that you were Lutheran. I knew that there's, Methodist, Catholic. But then I learned that there's something like 30 or 40,000 Christian denominations. And I just went, okay, I give up on trying to figure out which one's the correct one. Because if there's 40,000 of us, I don't have time to go through and figure out who's got the correct thing. So,
Sure.
So I'm just not going to waste my time.
Well, and some churches, denominations or churches, like, I feel like they don't even tell you explicitly what you're supposed to believe. Like, I try to be pretty upfront. If we have some new members of Lutherans, I'm like, hey, this is the stuff, and we're going to do an affirmation of faith, and here's what I understand that to mean. And then we could talk about the nuance between maybe faith and trust and belief, all of which have a similar Greek root word, pistis. And, we could get into the nitty gritty there, but I try to be upfront, like, hey, this is the stuff.
What is your desire to be upfront there about? Is it because there's a supposed to in there, or where does that come from?
I don't want to trick you. Like, I want you to know what you're getting into. To me, it's a serious thing. I talk about this with parents at baptism too. And like, I try to ask very genuinely, and I have to like be careful sometimes, because I know that, the question can come off as sort of potentially like rude or something, but it's like, why do you want to have your child baptized? Right? We do, children baptism, but it's just a very genuine. So I try to enter in that very genuinely, right? Or and not like a why, like you shouldn't be doing this, and not a why is it taking you so long, or an examination of your beliefs, but just like, I want you to know what you're getting into, because to me it's a real thing, and it's a transformative thing. And yeah, I don't want it to be hidden. I guess I know that, like, I've had experiences with folks, particularly in the Christian tradition, that like, I learned later that they were only being my friend to get me to come to church or whatever, right? Or things like this. And it's just like, and I understand that impulse, and I can trace it theologically, and by asking some good questions and like figuring it out and learning and things. But I don't want to be there. And so I want you to know, and then I want to give you space to ask questions, and I want to give you space to learn more about it. Not just before you become a member of our church in some official capacity, but also after. Because I don't know, there's a bad habit in my tradition of, like, once you're like 13 or 14, and you get confirmed, you affirm your baptismal promises. We treat it almost like graduation, and some people like never think deeply about their faith in a church classroom setting again. And so it's like, well, how can I encourage that curiosity? To me, maybe I'm, this might come back up later, but like, theology, the work of theology, of understanding God, is faith seeking understanding. So we start with the trust aspect of belief, and of faith, and then we seek to understand, and we keep on working at it. So I just want to ask the questions. I want to get people asking those questions. Is this something I believe? Is it not? If it's not, why do I want to be here? Do you want to be part of it anyway? Cool. Come on. Let's talk about it. Like, I'm genuinely curious. And to what degree does that matter? Let's talk about it.
I love it. Okay. I could ask, 3 more questions based on what you just said, but for the interest of time, I've got some more questions here, and some of them submitted by other people. So I want to try to give some space, but I'm loving it, Drew.
Sure.
I'm loving it so much. Okay. I want to ask this. Is it okay for me to have doubts about my faith and beliefs? I love that you just talked about, when people come to your church, you're very upfront. This is what we believe here. This is what we're about. This is what I believe as Pastor Drew. But is it okay for others to have doubts about their faiths and beliefs?
Yes. Next question. No. It's like I will no, that's one that I feel like I can kind of answer. It's I think that there is enough consistency throughout scripture to show that faith and doubt are not opposites, that being part of what God is doing in the world um, is not without doubt. In fact, that's very much something crucial to it. Um, and it might lead us deeper into, what does this look like? It might encourage us to question some assumptions we were afraid to question before. Um, and yeah, and I don't know, my experience, and this would be maybe if somebody asked me this question up front, I'd start with what I just started with, and then I'd follow up with a question of like, what do you believe and think the same way about every same thing every day? Like, and are you as convicted about the stuff you were feeling really strongly about yesterday today? And I think for most of us, that stuff kind of changes day in and day out to some degree, at
Yeah,
least,
especially if
right?
you zoom out like 5 years ago to today.
Sure.
And which version of me was more certain or more correct? And yikes.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm even just like, right, like there's like the impact of, we're playing a lot in like a headspace here, right? But there's like emotional impact. Like,
Hmm.
sure, I could say I believe this and not doubting this, but I certainly don't feel it the same way I did, on that one day in March or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and what does that have to say and teach us about that piece? And is that yeah, how does all of that interplay and interweave? I'll point to there's Lutheran pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber, and she talks about like one of the gifts of a community of faith is on the days where I can't believe it, someone else is believing it for me.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there's something really beautiful to that. Like we, again, maybe we'd have to dive into that a little bit deeper in talking about community and faith, but like the fact that we're in it together is a real nice thing when it
Hmm.
comes to that. Yeah,
Yeah, you said a couple of things that I want to just say them back to you, and if you want to jump on either of these. But
sure.
you said doubt is a crucial part to the faith thing. And that's an interesting statement. I don't know if you want to mention more about that, but
Yeah,
then you also brought in feelings there. I think
yeah,
often when we think about faith and beliefs, it all exists from here up. And so you mentioned doubt, you mentioned feelings and faith and belief. I'm curious if you want to talk about either one of those.
sure. Well, I'll talk a little bit more on the feelings thing because we were just talking about it. But just like I don't, there's language that I tend to use in instead of language like certain. Though I might say something like assure and certain hope. Um, Those in our funeral liturgy, like we pray in sure and certain hope of the resurrection. Um, and when I use language like in that sense, or if I were to quote, Paul in Romans 8 and say, "For I am convinced that nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus." Um, the way that I hear and understand those things is it's not just I've been convinced by the logic and reason of it, because there's too much mystery and paradox in the faith. There are too many unbelievable things. Um, there even I was just reading. I told you I was teaching church history stuff. The Cappadocian Fathers, Gregory of Nyssa is one of the first people to like talk about the Trinity, and he says you can only understand it in prayer.
Mm,
When I pray of the one, I pray of the three, and when I pray of the three, I pray to the one. And but again, it's not this. It's not this cognitive piece. He's like, it brings me to tears. It moves me because of the relationship and the love and the pieces in
mm,
it. Um, and so yeah, so there's something about that. I mean, I could also think of like, loving God with heart, soul, mind, right? Like it's all of it, right?
yeah.
It's thoughts and feelings and actions. And so there are days when uh and it's that Greek word pistis, that's trust, belief, and faith. And so to me, that, I kind of think of faith as trusting and believing. And one is more sort of like emotional, one is more heart centric, and one is more head centric and,
Mm.
and knowledge centric. And it's a both and.
I love
Um,
that. I also want to just point out that you just said there's too many unbelievable things about this tradition. That
sure.
I think it just makes my heart happy to hear a pastor say like, "Come on, here's our faith," and a lot of it's unbelievable.
Yeah, but like at the same time, then if you would ask me like, well, do you believe it? I'd probably end up with
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And
But see, there you already kind of played with unbelievable in one sense of the word, and then belief in that kind of deeper sense. So I love hearing you use that interplay between those things.
sure, and that's the same. The question, the follow up about doubt is kind of the same thing. But I'd look to it, as easy examples of the Great Commission story that I just shared of like some doubted and yet they were still sent. Like they were
Yeah.
there, they showed up, and they were still sent. Um, Thomas, right? He already has a nickname, the twin, and we give him another one, Doubting Thomas. And
Mm.
yet he's still blessed. Jesus still shows up. He still has a confession of faith. And in fact, maybe some of that stuff draws him in closer. Nicodemus, in the Gospel of John, he comes early, right? Like John 3:16 is actually said to Nicodemus. We mostly just know the words, but
Mm.
like Nicodemus comes in the middle of the night and he's like, what do you mean? How can I be born from above? And I can't crawl back up in the womb, and all of this stuff. And then we see a transformation later where he's like still showing up. And we don't know that like, well, now he has cognitively agreed to all of the same stuff, but he shows up again. And he loves Jesus, and he's there at the end at the cross when a lot of people aren't there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I love it. And you mentioned the Trinity, which I love. I can't remember if Gregory was from Greece Orthodox tradition, but I remember reading about the Greek Orthodox third or fourth century talking about the Trinity. And it's like, oh, it's not something for you to believe with your head, but it's more of something that puts you in an experiential place. That thinking on, meditating on, sitting with an idea of the Trinity that's a paradox that can't sit in your head can start to sink lower in what it does to you,
Yeah.
not so much something that you affirm. So I love that you
And
mentioned that.
And so, like, am I supposed to have back to one of those first questions, right? Am I supposed to believe everything? Am I supposed to have a Greek Orthodox understanding of the Trinity, or a Catholic understanding of the Trinity, or
Yeah, I love
or a
it.
North American understanding of the Trinity, or a Greek understanding? Like, yeah.
That's perfect. And what would your answer be to your own question? I feel like your answer
So
would just
that
be
one,
a big
yeah.
nod of just
Sure. Yeah. Right. I don't know. I still, my answer to that question is still like, what is supposed to mean, right?
yeah.
And why do you feel that way, and what is it that shows you? And we can talk about, why believe anything?
Yeah.
Again, for good reason, somebody might be afraid, because that's the kind of questions that I think are necessitated by some of those other ones, right?
Yeah. Okay, I want to flip to the other side here. We've been talking a little bit about doubt, and I know for me, doubt was something that hits close to my heart, because for a while it was really hard to doubt. It felt wrong, it felt scary, but there was just things I couldn't be certain of anymore. But for a long time, I was really certain, and there's certain things that I kind of feel kind of certain about now, um, different things and maybe in different ways. But I want to ask you about certainty. Is it okay for me? We've been talking about doubt, and maybe I feel a little bit better about doubt now, but what about certainty? Is it okay for me to be certain about my faiths and belief?
Yeah, I maybe would be. I have an easier time, and this is colored by sort of my tradition and personal experience. I have an easier time, also like bringing up the doubt stuff and engaging with it more than certainty. And here's, I think, why. Right? Saying like, well, why? What makes it easier? I also want to just give that a yes, right? Like, can I have doubts? Yes. Can I be certain? Yes. Um, but my caveat here is maybe just I want to make sure that whoever's asking me that question, or whoever's asking that question, I want to know what you mean by certain. Um, and do you mean certain for now, or do you mean certain for eternity, or do you mean I'm never going to ask a question about this again?
Uh,
And I think that's where Like I think if being certain in a way that we can't handle a question about it, or that we never question our assumptions about it, that to me seems a little bit dangerous. Like it seems like we could lose the thread if we're unwilling to question our own beliefs and assumptions, which is sometimes a really scary thing, like we talked about, right? It's stuff that's really core to us. So can you be certain? Absolutely. And should you be certain about certain things at certain times? Probably. Should you not? I don't know, right? But this is the same kind of tricky thing, because you're like, well, Drew, are you certain you should have married Lee? I'd be like, yeah. And I was like, so yeah, I don't know. There's a twist in there of like me being certain about being in relationship with someone is different than me being certain about a particular way that I think about things.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'd maybe want to tease out. It's like, well, what is that difference, and what's important about that difference? But to me, there is some nuance there. And then the same thing of like, well, am I certain about it in a way where I'm going to only ever be defensive if you challenge me on it or ask me about it? And there's probably plenty of stuff where I am that kind of certain. And that's exercising that muscles of like discomfort. Okay, so why, right? Like why that thing? What is it? Is that really like a core thing? Those are kind of the questions that I'd encourage all of us to sort of play with when we feel certain about something, with the caveat of saying like, yes, be certain. Absolutely. I think there's really a lot of good to it. And it's really hard, as we're experiencing right now, to live in constant uncertainty. Because I think about like certainty of, I used to know how to go to the grocery store. And then in March 2020, I was like, what do you mean go to the grocery store? What are we supposed to do? How does it know? And it took so much energy and effort and pain and stress. So yeah, I don't know.
That. I love that you kind of clarifying the difference of being in a relationship versus just kind of a heady version of certainty. And then what I also hear you saying is this contextual piece to the certainty. At one point you mentioned, is it okay to be certain about certain things at certain times? So you're bringing a temporal element into it. But it also makes me think, I once heard a guy go to a church, and after the church service, he talked to a couple people there. And one of the people, he was asking them about, he was asking one of the church congregants about, what's your experience been like here? And he started raving about the church, saying, I can't tell you about the amazing things it's done for me. I really believe in what the church is about and their beliefs and their values. It's transformed my life. The guy said, amazing. This sounds like the perfect church for you. And then he talked to another guy and asked him about his experience. And the guy said, I'm not really sure. I've got a lot of questions. The things that they believe just don't quite sit right with me. It's really causing some upset in some bad ways. And he said, this might not be the right church for you. The church believed the same thing, same church, but there was this contextual element that of like, well, what are the beliefs doing to you? What are these things that you're certain about? How are they playing out in your life? And I love that. That's what I hear in your saying and what you're saying.
Sure.
This contextual piece that we can't just pick out a belief or certainty and just look at it in isolation, but rather in context of relationship.
And even I'll bring up, there's a great book. Gosh, I just forgot the author's name, but the book is called Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. And the author, she does this fantastic job of talking about judger mindset and learner mindset. And it has to do with that, again, like how are you holding this, right? And to me, faith is this thing that we're always seeking understanding. We're always growing in our understanding. There's always kind of some movement. So if we're in that learner mindset and curiosity, the kind of mindset we're trying to bring into a conversation like tonight, am I willing to question even deeply held assumptions? Am I willing to sit with a question? And that doesn't mean like to say, am I willing to change my mind? I don't even want to like take you that far in it. Just like, am I willing to let the question be asked and to ask it myself?
Yeah. I love that. Well, Drew, I'm looking at the clock.
Yeah.
Up to you. I know you've got kids and your own bedtime.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? So I know we're at our like roughly 30 minutes. It looks like we still got a few folks hanging in there with us. Let's do a couple more. Let's see what we got. What do you think?
Yeah, let me ask you one or two more, but feel free to shut it down when you need to jump off.
Let's figure it out.
Um,
This is part of that doing a new thing, right? Like, how long do we actually need? How many questions should we prepare? How many questions do you want to ask us? Which, by the way, still friends, if you're with us, you can ask a question and it will fill up this lovely blank space over here. If you say hello and ask a question.
Yes, please. I've got these questions in front of me, but I would be
Yeah.
so happy to ask any questions. If anybody else has any questions about certainty, curiosity, faith. Drew, talk to me about faith and certainty. The way you've been talking about certainty and doubt, often I think it's kind of assumed that there's some level of certainty mixed in with faith. But the way you're talking about it, it's almost like doubt is the crucial element that needs to be mixed in. So it's almost like, is doubt necessary to have faith? And without doubt, is faith can it be called faith? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And again, I want to be clear there, right? I think all of that depends on how we're defining faith, doubt, certainty. But yeah, certainly in the way that I've laid it out and the definitions that I hold, it seems like a key ingredient to me for a healthy, living, active faith that is doing theology, that is faith-seeking understanding, that is beginning with this trust of there is a loving divine presence that is for me and that loves me, that's inviting me into relationship and into a way of life that brings more life and steadfast love for me and for the whole cosmos. And so like, there's a piece of like, well, yeah, like growing in a certainty of that. Right. So I mentioned that sort of sure and certain hope of the resurrection, or, ways we might say like, I'm convinced of this. I think, along the way, you probably do grow in certainty of that. But I think also like sometimes you doubt it, right? Because cancer diagnosis sucks and you're not supposed to get that. And that's not supposed to happen to you. And you ought to ask some good, hard questions. And you're following right in line with just about everybody who's ever, recorded their relationship with God, of like, God, what is the deal, right? Why pandemic? What are you doing, right? And with angst and anger and lament and sadness and all of it. But
if you could summarize the Bible, would that be your summary of just people going, God, what is the deal?
I mean, I don't know if I'd summarize the entire Bible that way, but I think it's definitely in there, right? There's themes that sort of kind of pop up.
That's definitely got to be one of the chapter headings, not even subheading, but one of the chapter headings is, what's the deal?
Yeah, if I was going to write a book about the scripture, I'd probably have a what's the deal, but that's just because I watched too much Seinfeld. No, but yeah, I don't know. I think there is something to doubt that is a motivator and a movement, and often the result of kind of convincing ourselves that doubt is bad or scary or not allowed is a stagnation, right? Is an unwillingness to move and flow. Yeah. And I'll bring back our Trinity. There's a word called perichoresis that describes the movement of the Trinity. It's like that the three persons of the Trinity are always dancing with each other, which is to say that like God is constantly in motion and moving and flowing. And so the fact that removing it often leads to stagnation makes me think that maybe it's part of the key.
That's good. Mix. It's like you take the doubt out of the mix and the faith kind of codifies. It kind of gets stale and, like you said, it stagnates. It's almost like faith is a help. Sorry, did I say the right words? Doubt is a helpful ingredient to keep the faith alive. It's like it's what kind of gives it some movement, some flexibility.
Yeah. I think it definitely can. I think there are also, I'm sure, certain times and places and experiences of things where it's like, man, a removal of doubt and a more sure and certain peace is a comfort and guide, and could can get us out of I'll pick on my own tradition, because we love to play in this land of like paradox as Lutherans, and this both and world, which I think is like the right space, but sometimes it keeps us from acting at all, which is a different kind of stagnation.
I think I'm a little bit Lutheran right now.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's like I need to if I need to be certain, like if I still have the need to be certain before I act, then I'm gonna like, let me read another book. Let me do another study. Let me figure out a thing, and then maybe I can enter the dance, right? Whereas if I'm certain, I'm probably more likely to just go ahead and enter the dance. Like, no, this is my time. This is what I do. I'm moving. I'm going. This is just what we do. So I think there's a time and place for that. But I think that again, like one without the other.
I think us evangelicals who are much more certain, I think we probably build buildings faster and raise money a little bit quicker than y'all Lutherans.
I'm sure.
Oh gosh, yeah, because we're certain, so it's we're ready to take action in an instant. Drew, let this be the last question I ask you.
Sure.
But I like this one. If certainty about my beliefs isn't the goal, then what is the goal? What is the point of my faith?
Yeah. Relationship with God and neighbor, right relationship, good, healthy, loving, that brings more abundant life to all. That's it, right? And so again, that's where maybe my caveat. Yeah. I mean, that's where maybe my caveat of like, I can be certain about a relationship, and that's not necessarily the same as being certain about like a fact or well, fact is maybe a misnomer there, but like a statement or a way of thinking. I can be certain about a relationship at a different level. To me, the goal of faith is abundant life and love for all. The goal of Christian faith, abundant life and love for all, and that exists in healthy, or we'd use this word kind of like right and whole relationship with God, with one another, with all of creation. And how do we grow in understanding and thinking about that? Well, we ask some really good questions, and we have some doubts, and then we're certain about some other stuff, and then we try some stuff and figure out the stuff we were certain about. Maybe we shouldn't have been certain about, but we should have been certain about this other thing. I don't know. What we should be certain about is, I think, at least today, and most days these days, what we should be sure and certain about is that it's about right relationship with God and neighbor. And that neighbor includes the planet and the universe, and that we ought to be moving towards more abundant life and love, justice, which includes justice and equity and peace, and so that we can dance. Yeah,
I love it. Right relationship with God and neighbor. You had that one ready to go. It seems like one of the things you're more certain about than others, but
sure.
This has been so fun. I as a pastor, I thought you were supposed to know the answers. I thought you're supposed to give me the certainty, give me the answers, but I love it that you don't.
Yeah. Well, and I did on a few, right? So here's my growing edge, right? Like I even gave you an answer at the end, because I probably could have just said like, I don't know, what do you think? Right. But that's a little bit of the difference. And that's the joy. I'll give a plug for a few things, right? The more of you that are watching and sharing in the chat and stuff, the more I can sort of defer a little bit, at least at first, and say, well, before I tell you what I kind of maybe think, or before I ask the next question, can turn that question back around, because that's where some of this exciting stuff happens. And that's, I hope, right, that like when Brandon is asking a question, you're wondering about it too. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's my role to invite you into the mystery. I was just at an ordination the other day, which is in my tradition, right? Like when somebody's becoming a pastor or a deacon. And one of the charges, one of the pieces of scripture that gets read says, think of us as stewards of God's mysteries. And so what does it look like as a pastor to be a steward of God's mysteries? not an answer book, but I find myself time and time again in spaces where people do look to me for the answers and things. And so I hope, in spaces like this, but also just sort of generally. And I try to be pretty open and honest and upfront with the folks at Spirit in the Hills and with other people where I'm not. But I told you sometimes I need a poke in the ribs to say, hey, Drew, I think you're saying something that in a way that sounds like it's the only way when you don't actually mean it that way. Got to remember to pause and to ask that question.
I feel like you're such a great steward of God's mystery. That's why I love talking to you. It's why you frustrate me too, because sometimes I just want an answer. And sometimes
me too.
It's perfect. Also, let me say for anybody watching now or later, questions you have around certainty and curiosity is still completely welcome, but also any questions or topics for the next one. We're planning on doing this again next Tuesday and the next Tuesday after that. We're going to be on here as long as I have questions. So that'll probably be at least for the next 5 or 10 years. We're going to be doing this on every Tuesday.
Yeah.
So
I was really ambitious. I put a 001 in the title, right? I was like, well, we could make it to triple digits. That's like 2 years, right?
So at least for the next 2 years, we'll be doing that to make that extra zero worth it. But if you have questions, I would love to ask your questions as well. If you want to send them ahead of time, or if you want to jump on here at 9 p.m. Central to ask them next Tuesday, we'll be jumping into some other topics. So if you have any topic ideas, please send them over.
Yeah. And on that same note, just a plug for I'll say this like maybe 2 different ways. One, my genuine hope is that we'll have some guests on as we get into other topics and different things. And so that it's not just me or even me and Brandon, and that sometimes I can turn some more questions. Yeah. And sometimes I can and yes, exactly. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Is like, there's some of this stuff, especially where the best thing I've learned and the thing that I'm most certain about in certain topics when it comes to faith and life and God and the world is that I'm not the person you should listen to right now. And so especially when we get into some more of those topics, I'd love to be able to invite some friends and guests and things on to sit and to play around and to ping pong some questions back and forth to do that. I was thinking there's a post, you may have seen it right here on Facebook, but people have been sharing, at least in my feeds, but I know that they're colored by I'm a pastor and there's a lot of pastors there, but it just was like an outlining of, Jesus is asked 180 something questions in the Gospels and he maybe only answers 8 directly. And that's debatable. Like that number's, it's maybe less than that.
That's a high number up there,
Right. And then he asks
close to 10%.
Sure. And then he asks like 300 questions.
Wow.
And so that's the hope, right? Like is to move into that space where maybe we're asking at least as much as we're answering in this space here. And to know the other role of that community is not only to, a role of the community of faith is not just to believe when you can't believe it today, but it's also to try and discern what seems good to the Holy Spirit and to you right now, and figure it out. So hopefully some guests, ideally some more diverse voices. Also a plug, there was a question in here tonight that we didn't quite get to about sort of like interfaith and other religions. I'm on the board of a local interfaith group. So one of my hopes is to get a few of my friends who are not Christian in to talk about, and we'd love to hear your questions about different faiths and interfaith relationships and how that all works, and religion in general, and religion that's not just from a Christian perspective. So yeah, a lot of fun ideas. We'll be here. Yep. Ask your questions now and later, and we'll see what we can get to. Any other final thoughts, Brandon?
I think that's it, man. I love it. I'm leaving with more questions than I came with. I don't know if that was your intent, but it feels good though. It feels good. And yeah, so I'll see you, Drew, again next Tuesday, 9 p.m. here on Facebook. And hopefully any of you guys who want to join us, hopefully this was fun. And would love your questions as we continue to what's this called? All questions considered. So
All
anything
questions considered. Yeah. Which, by the way, I'll give this. Here's my last thing. That's just for years. I love asking questions and playing around in curiosity and just kind of like not giving direct answers, and like playing in that space, in that learner mindset. I just love to learn things. And but I also love the NPR show All Songs Considered. It's just like, yeah, bring it on. Like from anywhere, from everywhere, whatever genre of question you've got. We're going to try and put together some great questions and chat about them, and inspire you to ask some more. I'm also probably doing this because every day when I got dropped off for school, my mom said, ask a good question. So maybe that's my last words for you from All Questions Considered from Melissa, the great Melissa Ingram, is ask a good question.
Ask a good question. I love it. All right. That's going to be my task.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll see y'all next week. Take care, everybody. Grace and peace.